السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Good evening. It's a beautiful night for me personally to be with Professor Rogan and to be with you all. I would like to thank you first for being here with us, discussing a book. I was telling Mr. Rogan just a few moments ago, which I loved. I read this book back in August, and this is one of the few books that when you start reading it, you just can't help yourself. You will finish it. Not only for the depth of information that you will find, but for the sincerity and the insight of the author. So, for all of this, and in this introductory remark, I would like to thank Dr. Rogan very much for writing a beautiful book, a balanced book, telling what's wrong as wrong, but also explaining what happened. I will now let the floor to Mr. Rogan, and I hope we will have a discussion that you will find interesting for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Naim. إذا تسمح لي نبدأ مع بعض الكلمات باللغة العربية. أريد أن أشكر أولا كل الشركاء الكرام على حضوركم الليل، ويسرني سرور عظيم أن أكون معكم في الرياض، زيارتي الأولى منذ عصر الكوفيد. والنقطة ابتدائية لكتابي عن حوادث الشام تبدأ في أرشيف واكتشاف مجموعة من الوثائق والتقارير كلها مكتوبة باللغة العربية، وكانت مفقودة داخل الأرشيفات لأنها كانت مكتوبة بالعربية. كانت في الولايات المتحدة في الأرشيف الوطني في واشنطن، ومن هذا المدخل دخلت إلى موضوع حوادث الشام 1860. ومنذ ذلك تلك الفترة كنت طالب الدكتوراه، كان في عام 1989، يعني انتظر هذا الكتاب 35 سنة أن يخرج ككتاب. فأشعر فعلا بالراحة والسرور نستطيع أن أشترك بعد الاكتشاف من هذه التقارير والوثائق. وأغير إلى اللغة الإنجليزية هلا، بس إذا في أي أسئلة بالعربي طبعا فيما بعد كبر رد عليها.
Okay.
I would like to thank those who have organized and who have invited me tonight for the honor of coming to the King Fahad National Library. Particular thanks go to His Royal Highness Prince Faisal bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. And I must express my appreciation for the attention and the energy he is bringing to the King Fahad National Library. This is a great national institution, and I see with the energy and enthusiasm that he brings to the library, it will go from strength to strength. So it's exciting for me to be here to see this, and I am so grateful to be able to have an evening with this distinguished audience. I know that each of you brings far deeper knowledge of this history than I can share, so it's an honor to be with all of you tonight. Libraries and archives hold a special place in the cultural life of a society. They hold the key to our understanding of the past, and they inspire our vision for the future. In the Western experience, someone like Shakespeare referenced far too many books in his works than he could have owned himself. So you know that Shakespeare went to a library to write the finest plays in the English language. And perhaps an example that you will appreciate less, but when Karl Marx wanted to write his theories of communism, he went to the British Library It is a place in which visionaries can find the materials with which to realize their vision. As I visited the King Fahad Library this week, I've seen dozens of Saudis of all ages coming in search of knowledge from its rich collection. I see in this library a refuge from the rapid exchange of fake news on social media. If you want to come to grips with truth and reality, you come to a library. It's a service to the nation, and it gives me hope for the future. In my own work as a historian, I've taken so much inspiration from the libraries and the archives that have given me the sources for my books, which I can see on the photograph behind me on the wall. The origins of my most recent book, The Damascus Events, lie in a visit I made to the U.S. National Archives when they were still held in downtown Washington, D.C. They've now moved to College Park, Maryland. This was back in 1989 when I was a doctoral student. I was doing work on my thesis on Ottoman rule in Transjordan when I discovered the first 3 volumes of consular reports from Damascus. The first American vice consul in Damascus was a native of Mount Lebanon whose name was Mikhail Mishaka. Mishaka, though one of the best educated men in Syria and an employee of the United States government, he never learned English. And so he kept all of his reports in Arabic, in his own handwriting. He kept a record of them in a small notebooks that he would find in Damascus. The American archivists had no way to read these documents to know what they held. And so they weren't able to shelf them in order with the other volumes from Damascus that were subsequently written in English, and just left them on a shelf where I was to discover them in 1989. They were happy to be able to reunite the first 3 volumes with the collection. But my happiness, I don't know. I might have been the first person to hold these notebooks since Mikhail Mishaka himself put them down. But I was certainly the first researcher to access these volumes. They remain my most exciting discovery in an archive ever. Mishaka's reports began with his appointment as United States Vice Consul to Damascus in 1859. His reports thus cover the breakdown in society in Damascus that led to an unprecedented massacre of Christians in the summer of 1860. Yet more interesting for me, the reports continued until Mishaka's retirement from his job in 1870. So we have a full decade of reports in the years that followed the events, which document the process followed by the Ottoman state to try and rebuild the damaged Christian quarters and reintegrate the Christian community into the society of Damascus.
Eyewitness reports. Eyewitness reports. I mean, he eyewitnessed all of this.
They're amazing reports. Now, the 1860 events in Lebanon and Damascus remain one of the most important moments in the modern history of the Middle East. As we were talking about before, Albert Hourani, the great Oxford historian, began his teaching of the modern history of the Middle East in 1860. And the Mishaka reports are without doubt the most important news source on these events yet to be discovered. What makes the Mishaka reports so valuable is that unlike the histories of the events written by other survivors, usually 5 or 10 years later, these reports were written at the time without the bias of hindsight. Mishaka had no idea when he was writing these reports what the future held. And so they capture better than any source I have ever read the fears and the understanding of each moment of each year in the aftermath of the events. Mishaka himself wrote a history, Al-Jawab al-Iqtirah al-Ahbab, which was translated in English under the sensational title of murder, mayhem, pillage, and plunder, a history of Syria in the 18th and 19th century. I like Mishaqa's title better, الجواب على اقتراح الأحباب, the response to the suggestion of the loved ones. But it's his history of his family and their experiences, and he recounts his family's experiences in the events of 1860. But he wrote that 13 years after the events. It reads very differently from his reports. What emerges from the reports is a more detailed portrait of Damascus in a terribly turbulent moment in its history that gives us more details than has ever been possible to talk about these events. And what emerges is a real city. This is not a postcard Damascus. This is a Damascus with poverty, with crime, with all of the kinds of issues that afflict any city. People with rich and fascinating characters. Now, while the Mishaqa reports were the main inspiration and the main source, you can't write a book on a city like Damascus on the basis of one person's record only. So in the intervening years, I have been traveling to libraries and to archives in Istanbul, in Beirut, in Damascus. I've worked my way through archives in Europe and in the United States to try and find documents, letters, muzakirat, to try and get other perspective to bring to bear on what Mishaqa's reports give us. And from this, we have, for instance, from the wonderful Ottoman archives of Istanbul, all of the reports submitted by Fuad Pasha. Fuad Pasha, a man of the Ottoman period of reforms known as the Tanzimat, served as foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire. He would later become Grand Vizier or Prime Minister. He was sent by Sultan Abd al-Majid as minister plenipotentiary to resolve the problem of Mount Lebanon and Damascus after the events in these two places. And Fuad's reports remain remarkable documents on how effective Ottoman governance could be. I'll come back to that in a moment. But truly he emerges from those documents as an outstanding statesman who fully succeeded in what could only be described as a mission impossible, to try and restore the law and order to Damascus after these events. I went to Damascus. I found several kunnash, or sort of diaries, scrapbooks kept by Muslim notables of Damascus. I didn't want to write this history uniquely from a Christian perspective. What did the Ayyan, the Muslim notables of Damascus, experience of these events? So, you may be familiar from the work of Kamal Salibi, great Lebanese historian, with the kunnash of Muhammad Abu Saud al-Hasibi. Al-Hasibi was a sharif. He would become Naqib al-Ashraf towards the end of the 19th century of Damascus. He was arrested in the aftermath of the events on suspicion of having taken part in the violence. And he was sent into jail, and he spent the year after the events in prison. So we have, from the eyes of one of the notables of Damascus, the prison experience and the punishments that were meted out to many of the Ayyan. He saw people being led away to execution. He saw people being sent off into exile. So he had a very distinct perspective that I was able to weave into the story. Or Muhammad Sa'id al-Ustuwani wrote a wonderful diary of sort of the key events of the year. He was the khatib, or the preacher, of the famous Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. He was revered by Damascene Muslims for his learning, and he was respected by the Ottoman officials for his authority among Damascenes. He was equally observant of the mood of people in the mosque and in the streets. So he gives me very valuable eyes on the city of Damascus through the very same years as Mishaqa's reports. And then there's the Emir Abd al-Qadir al-Jazairi. Abd al-Qadir will be familiar to all of you for his role as leader of Algerian resistance to the French occupation of his homeland. And when he was finally taken prisoner by the French, he went into exile in the Ottoman Empire and ultimately settled in 1855 in Damascus. And he was received in Damascus as a man of deep learning in Islamic sciences and as a man who was seen as a hero for resisting foreign occupation of his country. And he immediately was accepted among the notables of Damascus. He was also a very prolific letter writer. And in Damascus, he was accompanied by about 1,200 Algerian veterans of the Algerian war against the French. So he was the only person in Damascus who had a militia, who had an armed force at his disposal to intervene at the time of the events to try and save lives. And we can really say that he played a key role in preserving as many as 85% of the Christians of Damascus from massacre. So a very rich and fascinating character. These and others provided different perspectives on the story of the Damascus events that I was able to weave together in making this narrative, along with the Ottomans and Damascenes, Christians and Muslims. You have the European consuls, the American missionaries, to give you just a sense of the complexity of this very, very foreign land. It allowed me to tell the story of Damascus and its events in a manner that was more like a Netflix series than a dull and dusty history of 19th century Damascus. Now, one of the first questions people ask me when I tell them about the book is, why did the Muslims kill the Christians of Damascus? Why did this massacre happen? There was no previous history of violence between the communities. And I try and answer that question in the first 4 chapters of the book. The changes that took place in society, in the economy, and in politics all contributed to such tensions as led to an unprecedented massacre, something that had never yet been seen in the history of Damascus. So in terms of the economy of Damascus, I trace the changes in the trade of the city that accompanied the development of industrial exports from Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean, carried by steamships, which were much faster than sailing ships and much more regular. And a growing trade of industrial products being dumped on the markets of Damascus was increasingly displacing Damascus's traditional trade by camel caravan with overland destinations in Baghdad and with the Hajj pilgrimage to the Hijaz. These were the sources of the distinctive wealth of the markets of Damascus. Damascus was a port, but it was a port that looked towards a sea of desert rather than a sea like the Mediterranean. And the thing about caravan trade is that only products of very high value are worth carrying on camels. You can fill a ship with grain and make money from that. But you will only take spices, silks, precious metals, jewelry, coffee, products of high value on a camel caravan. So you have this change going on of the displacement of this high-value overland trade with the cheap industrial products of Europe. And remember, all those ships that come carrying woolen and cotton fabrics, when they empty their holds, they need to fill them with new products to take back to Europe. And they take cotton and wool and grain from the markets of Syria, which creates an inflation in all the primary products that the artisans of Syria depend on themselves. The silk of Syria. All of this goes into these ships going back to Europe, putting the artisans and the merchants of Damascus under tremendous pressure. And the only people who are benefiting are those Christian merchants who served as agents for the European houses. So we see a benefit to certain Christian families who are getting rich, while many in Damascus are getting poor by very significant economic changes happening in the 1840s and 1850s. Politically, European consuls followed the traders. So you have British, French, Prussian, Russian, Greek, Austrian, American with Mishaka, consulates opening in Damascus in this period. And they brought with them extraterritorial privileges, the imtiyazat. And this meant that not only did the foreign agents enjoy tax benefits, access to foreign law rather than Sharia law of the Ottoman Empire, but also all of the local Christians that they hired to serve these consulates also benefited from the same extraterritorial privileges. So this meant that if a Christian was hired to serve in the Austrian consulate, they would become an Austrian subject, and they would enjoy all the tax advantages and all the legal exemptions of an Austrian. So if a Muslim has a complaint against this Christian who enjoys Austrian protection, they can't take him to a qadi to make their case. They have to go to the consulate, where the consul will always privilege the Christian. And in this way, once again, we see an advantage to the minority community at the expense of the majority community, contributing to building tensions. And then thirdly, if the Ottoman Muslim expected anyone to defend them, it was the government of the Sultan. The Sultan was the Khalifa. He was the Caliph of the Sunni Ummah and had responsibilities to preserve the interests of the Muslims of the Sultanate. But they also had to do balance of power politics. And the Ottomans were very concerned to prevent European intervention in the Ottoman Empire on behalf of minority communities, particularly Christian churches and the Jewish community. The British also protected the Druze for interesting historical reasons. These politics of intervention, compromised Ottoman sovereignty, could even lead to war. You can trace the origins of the Crimean War to these politics. And so the Ottomans accepted to make reforms under the Tanzimat that would raise the status of non-Muslim minorities to an equal legal standing with Muslims, which to many today sounds like a natural thing, that all citizens should have the same legal standing. But in the Ottoman Empire of the 19th century, where Sharia was still the law, there are things not just in Sharia, but in the Quran itself that distinguish between the communities. It was as if the Sultan was taking the presumption to contradict God's word. And for conservative Muslims in Damascus, the reform that gave equal rights to Christians and Jews was a violation of their faith. So these social, economic, and political changes were, if you like, inverting what conservative Damascenes saw as the natural order of their city, in which the dominant social group were the Sunnis, the a'yan among the Sunnis most of all, the notables who were in the majlis, and in which Christians and Jews were respected and protected, but distinctly second class. That was the order. And this order is being challenged by all these changes.
Let me just comment on this, Mr. Rogan. Of course, most of us, when reading a book, will read it with his or her own eyes. As a political scientist, I saw a reaffirmation of a phenomenon which we know that happened in different continents. Western encroachments, interferences, political, military, economic, but also cultural, tend most often to destabilize societies. In most cases also they spread fear. As Mr. Rogan was alluding to, was explaining, sometimes the majority feels threatened, or sometimes the old elite, economic elite, political elite, feels also threatened by the ascendancy of another group or another community. We saw this in Africa, we saw this in Latin America, we saw this in Eastern Asia, and of course in North Africa and in the Middle East here. So when I saw this, I said, oh, I was remembering my old studies when I was a doctoral student at UCLA. We saw this in different parts of the world. But let us now go back to, because this is my takeaway great takeaway from Mr. Rogan's book. The effect, the impact of foreign interference in the affairs of here Oriental societies, and a society like Damascus, but also like Jabal Lebanon, in Lebanon also, because also maybe more maybe catastrophic changes were made in Jabal Lebanon, comparing it with Damascus itself, by itself.
Yeah.
So, you know, a new political structures was created to be reshuffled and substituted with another system, bipolar system. In the beginning, bipolar, but also in the aftermath of the 1860 events, massacre of Christians in Jabal Lebanon, by the Druze. A new principality was created, a unitary principality with a Christian at the head of it, increasing the antagonism and the hatred and the suspicions of the Druze especially, let alone other communities in Lebanon.
Yeah.
So why? Because that's the way the Western governments interfered. That it was their decision. Mr. Rogan made it clear that Fouad Pasha, the foreign minister at the time, was working strenuously to save the empire, to keep Syria, Greater Syria, under Ottoman control. And he saw the only way is to stop the massacre, show the big arm of the government in suppressing it, and also in bringing the guilty to justice. And he did, with, of course, more increasing and continuing pressures of the Western councils, who are not far away. But after that also, so I go back to the result of their interference that they created. He saved Damascus. Fouad Pasha saved Damascus by his strong policies and effective measures, and by of course, the development projects that the Ottoman government initiated afterwards. But for Lebanon, he was unable to do so. I mean, Western pressure was so great that another system, another principality, as we said, with a Christian head, should be created, and it was created. It had been created at the time.
But Professor, can I ask you a question? Because I mean, I very much appreciate your reflections. As a political scientist, when you look at the interventions of the foreign powers in Ottoman domains, can you see parallels with the modern doctrine of the responsibility to protect? You know, this idea that it is a duty of states to intervene to protect vulnerable minorities. Because I find it quite interesting to think of the response of the British, the French, to these events as a precursor to that. And it makes us think of the imperial ways in which perhaps responsibility to protect is exercised today. So do you think that there's something? Well,
I cannot exclude totally the good intentions of some.
Right.
The missionaries, even some of the politicians and bureaucrats. But they often tend to first have strong and quick reactions, and second, that they rarely discuss the situation and the cause of the events. they have no will to trace what happened, as you did in your book. Had Rogan been with them, they would not do that. I hope. But
you see with the French, I mean, their response is to send 6,000 soldiers
yes.
to the shores of Lebanon. And they want to deploy those soldiers to Damascus through the Wadi Taym.
Mm-hmm.
They want to earn glory by killing the people who killed the Christians, which for Fuad Pasha makes that French army a ticking time bomb. Now, maybe their motive was humanitarian, to protect vulnerable people. But for the Ottomans, they saw it as imperial. This was a bid by France to extend its hegemony over the Syrian coastal regions. And I think the Ottomans were right to be concerned.
Of course. I mean, in one of the pages, in many pages actually, it's you cannot but sympathize with the victims, like in Damascus.
Yeah.
When a neighbor turns against his neighbor or her neighbor, I mean that's tragic.
Yeah.
You cannot even feel secure even with your neighbor.
No.
You have been dealing with them for years and years, so of course it's tragic. But I go back to the ability to trace what happened, the evil that happened to what we did to this society, what we did politically, economically, everything, culturally, of course. And I still remember that not long time ago, you cited the Imam of the Umayyad Mosque when he was deploring the Tanzimat and the egalitarian new wind. That's and he was saying at the end, "Wala hawla wala quwwata illa billah." That's, he finished with this. So of course, the government, as you said, that was supposed to protect them because they are being, assaulted by Western governments on different fronts. This government is also initiating these changes, legal changes, political changes that weakens them more. So you traced it's good. You traced this very well. And had Western governments been able to do the same, the result would be different.
Well, what happens, of course, is the Christians become more assertive. They're getting rich. They have new powers by their connections to these European consulates. And they have new legal rights. And they become very assertive. And it's like salt in the wounds of the injured pride of the A'yan of Damascus. Let me quote one passage from Al-Hasibi, who is our Sharif, who will become the Naqib al-Ashraf. He writes, "The Europeans entered the Syrian lands and impressed on the Christians that the Tanzimat, the reforms, made the Muslims and the Christians the same, all God's creatures. So why shouldn't a Christian wear the same clothes as a Muslim, and so on? If a Christian quarreled with a Muslim, whatever the Muslim said to him, the Christian would say the same and more. If they complained to the government, it would take the side of the Christians." So for Al-Hasibi, who is a notable of a distinguished Damascene family, this is an inversion of the natural order. There was a way in which people behaved in society, and these changes were making irreversible changes in society that they didn't wish to live with. But you also brought up the role of Mount Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And I think the conflict between the Druze and Maronite is of a very different origin than what happens in Damascus. The Druze are actually the minority. The Druze were perhaps 25% the size of the community of the Christians. It's better than that. I think the Druze could count about 18,000 fighters, the Christians over 50,000. Mm-hmm. But they were coming to a point where the Christians were growing increasingly assertive in Mount Lebanon.
In their own homeland, as they see it.
As they see it, particularly in the Shuf. And the Christians are talking about driving the Druze out of Jebel Lubnan and making it into an entirely Christian principality. And the Druze hold together, and they attack with surprise, and they achieve a shocking level of violence, where in a matter of a few weeks they kill 11,000 mostly fighting age men sort of between the age of 14 and 40 were the main targets. The women tended to be allowed to go free. Children were fine, and old people they tended not to. I mean, people got killed along the way, but the target was men of fighting age. So this was, if you like, the Druze had identified the threat that the Maronites in particular posed to their position, and their strategy for this existential threat was extermination. I call this a genocidal moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the people of Damascus, they were coming to identify their own Christian community as a threat, this change to the social order. But it was the example of the violence in Mount Lebanon that planted the evil seed that extermination could be a solution. And there is a growing excitement recorded in Mishaqa's reports as the Muslims of Damascus watched the Druze kill the Maronites. So that by the time you reach the fall of the city of Zahli, which is mostly Greek Catholic, it's not Maronite.
Yes, it's a Catholic.
It's a Greek Catholic town. But it was still part of this Druze movement. Zahli was a stronghold, and they wouldn't feel safe as long as there was a Christian town as powerful as Zahli. But the shopkeepers in Damascus celebrate the fall of Zahli by hanging lanterns in the market. And the Ottomans had to go through and say, put them down, bring them down. There was a bloodlust growing that turns the anger of Damascus into a genocidal moment as well. And then it just took a spark to turn people to violence. And that's the Damascus events.
I remember that you tried to explain the Druze's point of view at that time. Of course, there's nothing to explain massacre. It's a genocide, as you said. But their calculation was that sooner or later, Christians will, of course, they are the majority. They came after us, and they now occupy most of our homeland. Sooner or later, they will start the fight. So if we let them start the fight, and we are a minority, we will be exterminated. So best to surprise them. Surprise, of course, sometimes peaceful, unprepared villages, towns, with families. It's horrible. It's horrible. But that's the way they calculated it.
The shocking thing is, it's not unique to Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as though they are people made of different moral fiber than us. One of the things that struck me about the relevance of this history, as a historian, I think it's very important to indicate how the past is still relevant for our understanding of things today. And we continue to witness genocidal moments.
Of course.
And obviously, since I wrote this book, we have Israel being accused of genocide in Gaza before the International Court of Justice. I'll leave the judges to decide that case. We don't have to do that here. But it has been raised as the idea of people calling for elimination or extermination. But in our lifetimes, Cambodia, the Rohingya people in Myanmar, the Darfuri people in Sudan, in Xinjiang, the Uyghur people, what happened in the breakup of Yugoslavia in Bosnia, Daesh and the Yazidis. I want to say this isn't something that I would point a finger towards people in the Middle East or this region. In Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, we have known moments where societies have broken down in this way. I think it's important for us to study what are the factors that can lead to such a breakdown. And it's nice to have an example in Ottoman history where the Ottomans found solutions to help rebuild and restore this deeply divided society. It's a long-term project, as we follow in the book. But I would argue after 25 years, the Ottomans had succeeded in rebuilding, in redeveloping Damascus, and reintegrating the Christians in a way that left no sectarian legacy. This is a success that I would hope other societies that have suffered genocidal moments might be able to replicate.
Yes. Well, that's a sign of how important is a book. Because now this book brings us back to a story that was told here and there, but also with vivid illustration, with excellent account, with simple. It's like Taha Hussein used to say, they say about his style, السهل الممتنع.
Yeah.
That's what came to my mind when I was reading this.
That is huge praise. I've just been compared to Taha Hussein. Okay, my hats won't fit my head anymore. But then the question is, what does it take to get people who have been deeply divided by this kind of trauma to turn the page on history and look forward to a future together? And I think the most important thing that a society can do to heal these wounds is to provide a better future for the next generation. If there is anything that will allow people to put down their demands for total justice, you want accountability. Those who have done violence, some of them are going to have to face justice. You can't have no justice at all after violence. But total justice could be the perfect being the enemy of the good. You want to go for something good even if you can't have perfection. Total justice you won't achieve. So what will allow you to say, okay, I'll accept that we don't get total justice, is if I can see that for my children, there will be the prospect of security and education, the possibility of dignified work, a place in society that's better than where things are. I think of people in Gaza. It wouldn't take much to persuade Gazans of a resolution as long as it provided for the needs of their children. I think people can make great sacrifices for that.
After all the misery that they have
After all the misery. So that's where I'd be looking if I was thinking, what is the lesson, you know? Ibrat hawadith al-sham. I think the lesson here is, how do you think about what will allow the next generation to live better than we do? You can give them that. We can begin to heal societies.
I just will maybe, thank you very much. I will just end with a final remark. I have in my mind a policy that was, sometimes declarations, sometimes just comments by the Saudi government since 2001. And the essence of that is that changes in our state or society have to go with the mood with the culture, with the traditions of the society. That doesn't mean, of course, stagnation. Never, because this is untenable. Untenable.
Yeah.
To speak about tradition as a fixed stigma for society. But how do you rephrase it by a political scientist? I will try to rephrase it, that social changes will have to be accepted by either the majority of the people or by a strong strata, effective of the society, that because they can uphold it. I think even members of, I hate to speak about minorities, but sometimes even reasonable people of minorities like in Lebanon or in Syria came to the conclusion that changes cannot succeed until they are accepted by the majority, by Sunni Muslims in our society. When they are accepted, don't make them afraid.
Yeah.
Don't destabilize them. No. Let them be partners with you. So the Druze were afraid, and they behaved butcherly. They behaved in a very murderous way. But also the majority Sunnis for different reasons, which Mr. Rogan explained, also were afraid. They are the majority, but they were afraid. And all this resulted in the massacre of 1860 in Damascus. So, no, make every people, all the people, partners in changes yet to come. That's where I think these will have good chance to succeed.
Well, we have a region with so many problems, so many conflicts, so many deeply divided societies, that one can only hope that this kind of wisdom might lead governments towards beginning to solve these problems.
Thank you, Mr. Rogan. I thank you for this beautiful moment.
Thank you, Professor.
You brought me from the man to here. You brought me to my origins. That's how I thrive usually, and I hope I did tonight. But I hope you enjoyed our discussion tonight. Thank you all for coming. I will say it again. I am honored. I'm flattered to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.